well, welcome to futurebuild. So off we go. So obviously we've had in the last couple of years we've had lots of warnings that we are having. Well, we've just had the 5th hottest year on record. We had 12 years to go from the United Nations IPCC last year. The Met Office is saying that in the UK they have had 18% more extreme rainfall events. All of these things are very pertinent to us in our industry to make resilient buildings, let alone to make zero carbon or indeed net zero buildings. And quite how all this affects our existing stock is really, something we need to address very urgently. And I was horrified when I was putting these slides together to realize that I did a report for Zero Carbon Hub actually 10 years ago. I wrote it in 2009 about future climate change in relation to what was then our journey to zero carbon. And I have to say that so little has changed in the meantime that we've got to play catch up now. And that told us that we have an overheating problem, and that we have to address our warming climate and adaptation as well as mitigating the impacts of climate change. So we have had lack of clarity in policy. Obviously, we have the scrapping of the zero carbon homes agenda. Sorry, do you need your book? Okay. We've also got somewhat of a confusion about whether local authorities are able to set standards higher than building regulations. Ooh, lovely. The Planning and Energy Act was to be amended to say that local authorities couldn't, and then the government chose not to enact that clause. So we've been in a bit of ambiguity following the publication of the NPPF last year. The UK Green Building Council had a letter clarifying the situation, saying that yes, local authorities could set their own standards, but we know, many of us know, that actually this is subject to legal challenge, and indeed has been challenged successfully through even planning inspectors have been finding against that. So yes, in order to accelerate our journey, we clearly need clarity on that aspect as well as what exactly we're going for. In the meantime, GLA are marching ahead. And actually last year, Theresa May made this announcement in support of the clean growth strategy, saying we are to halve all building energy use in new buildings by 2030, which gives us about 10 years. And also mentioned retrofit, said that we are to aim to halve the cost of reaching that same standard in our existing stock, which gives us basically a mountain to climb. In the meantime, we have the core cities saying they want to go net zero by 2030. We have local neighbourhoods and district councils and local councils declaring climate emergency. I think 50 at the last count, and growing, a growing number. So clearly there's a huge gathering momentum, and I'm pleased to say that our children are also taking to the streets. So this is something, considering that the built environment represents, about 40% of our total UK emissions, something we have to address urgently, and hopefully conferences like this will help us on our journey and send a clear message to policymakers. So we have the high-level strategy from the Climate Change Act and from the Jodrell Bank commitments. And we're told now by MHCLG that they will review the building regulations on energy efficiency Part L and Part F and address overheating over the next year. And we're expecting a consultation sometime this year. So clearly the chase is on. We have to be ready to input into that consultation and bring to bear our own experience of what has and hasn't been happening over the last 10 years. At the same time, we're also recognizing it's not just about energy. It can't just be about energy. This is something that went slightly wrong last time. We focused only on so-called zero carbon, but in fact we were recognizing that there were so-called unintended consequences, things like the interaction with ventilation and indoor air quality, and indeed the whole aspect of mainstreaming this agenda in order to get cost reductions and use our technologies, the technologies that are now at our disposal in terms of digital transformation and off-site production and so on. So this has to be seen as a holistic challenge, and of course Grenfell, the tragedy at Grenfell was a real wake-up call to the industry, but also to government, I think, suddenly waking up to the fact that, what you get is not necessarily what it says on the tin, and that has given extra spur, really, to the government's sector deal and the Challenge Fund projects and all that. So bringing the industry up to speed, doing joint ventures in terms of research funding and so on, to actually make sure that we change our culture so profoundly that we can actually deliver what we say we're going to deliver. So, just a word on the existing stock. I couldn't resist raking up the report I authored for the task group in Scotland for a low carbon building standards strategy, which they're still benchmarking to, and was basically so this is over 10 years old, but it was basically a government and industry joint statement of intent, really, in the context of climate change and the sustainable built environment. And I really wish we had something that was kind of overarching in that way, but in a sense we do now have that in terms of the clean growth strategy. So, so in Scotland now has an energy efficiency plan. And that's really what we need in the UK. So you may say the targets aren't ambitious enough, but at least, it's setting very, very clear objectives for retrofit of our stock and its potential contribution to our carbon footprint going forwards. This is, we're already spending 20 billion on repair and maintenance. So this has to be something that all of us potentially have economic opportunities from, as well as could make a major contribution to carbon reduction. So what's very interesting to me is that we're at this kind of crossroads now where we've realized that it doesn't do what it says on the tin. That's actually also true of our predictions on energy performance. And I think it's inevitable that we are moving towards a culture in terms of carbon impacts. We're moving towards a culture of verification of actual performance. And this is something which the London Energy Transformation Initiative, otherwise known as LETI, have strongly campaigned for in relation to the London Plan. They've got some really good people on their task groups and made some very proactive recommendations. And one of them is that actually they're suggesting through the planning process is that there is a verification of end-use performance for developments in London. And they're finalising a methodology to do this. So that would really put the writing on the wall, because you can't hide behind a kind of notional calculation anymore. You have to get real with it. So GLA have really blazing a trail there, and indeed what is called in Australia the Neighbours initiative on improving performance in commercial buildings has now been announced as Design for Performance with a London pilot with major London developers, and their whole ethos is that part of the contract for a building includes a energy performance target which is verified at the end of the day, and it's been shown in Australia in Melbourne to have delivered between 40 and 60% reduction in energy use in major commercial buildings already, and I know that's base build, so the tenant loads are still to be added onto that, but that's a massive change, and and really puts us in the shade. So hopefully these London design for performance pilots will again show us the way there. I've talked about the build quality in the context of Grenfell, but actually one of the major first recommendation of the Zero Carbon Hub's performance gap report was that we need better energy literacy across the industry. I've been doing quite a lot of work in schools of architecture over the last couple of years, and I have to say that this is not something which is mainstreamed certainly in architectural education, and I suspect in other professional education systems. It's not implicit really, and without a common language across the professions and indeed across the whole industry, we're going to really struggle to deliver on this, because it's not something which architects can just deliver or engineers can just deliver. It has to be a collaborative approach and basically a collective accountability. So yeah, I've talked about Grenfell, and it's not I see that as just a major change for all of us, and hopefully for the better, for the sake of those that died in that fire. So I've been leading a task group on responding to the building's energy mission on behalf of the Green Construction Board, and we framed our response, or we are framing our response to the halving all building energy use by 2030, all new building energy use by 2030, in the context of a holistic challenge for reviving, if you like, the supply chain, although looking around me, it's sort of, showing signs of life already. But yeah, so galvanizing the UK supply chain, which will support our journey to halving and indeed net zero ultimately. And also consider health and well-being. So we can't have these unintended consequences. It has to deliver positive benefits to users and residents. And it also has to take advantage, as I said earlier, of the digital possibilities of our age and the industrialized potential, which some are already grasping. So the way I tackled this challenge, and we're hopefully going to be producing a report shortly showing that some buildings are already meeting this challenge, which is great, but they're not buildings that set about to comply with building regulations. They're buildings that set about to deliver a total energy reduction or a percentage of total energy reduction. So where did they start? They started from recognizing what buildings used and what occupants of buildings used in totality. They then sought to reduce the energy demand of the buildings, and then they matched that with renewable energy. And we do actually have some examples of where this has been done. And this is the approach that Neighbours have taken, Energisprong has taken, Specific has taken, Z0 Positive Bill Dunstead has taken. And there are some paradigms out there that have been monitored and shown to perform. So keep your eyes peeled for our report, which hopefully we will get into the public domain through the Green Construction Board. So basically, in order to balance supply side with demand side, we have to bring the energy demand of buildings right down, which means better performance, better efficiency of products and so on. And Passive House has got many examples of having done this, but actually to make it totally zero, you need to go Passive House Plus, which is the adding renewable energy bit. So, and the other thing to recognise, and this is actually from John Palmer's work from the Passive House Trust, is that, if you say, well, we can use, as much energy as we want, we just have to deliver enough renewables. Actually, if you do the sums, if you do the maths, and you factor in the fact we've got this performance gap, then actually we haven't a hope in hell of matching our demand loads, because seasonally we're out of kilter. We're tending to produce in the time of year when we actually don't need that much energy for our buildings to work efficiently. So you know, the other thing is to predict the peak demand and be very clever about our energy management. So it's another dimension to look forward to. So kind of last but not least, really, well, that's just an example of Energiesprong, which there are some other presentations on this at futurebuild. So I encourage you to go and drink that in from the Nottingham pilot, albeit small, but they did start from total energy use. They did include unregulated energy, and they did do peak demand and load management and so on. So and actually in the Netherlands, okay, with a following wind in the form of 100,000 homes commitments, they've actually made it not only net zero, but self-financing. So just to wind up, really, looking ahead between now and 2030 and beyond to 2050, you know, we've got a lot to do, but how many building regs reviews are we going to get in between now and then? We're looking very closely on the Green Construction Board Task Group at what moves need to be made at what time in order to deliver this. And we've had a very interesting example from Sean Pender from the Vancouver City Council, who came along and spoke to Bays and others and spoke at the Passive House conference this year, showing us how they've actually tackled the issue of going net zero by 2025, which is certainly not to be sneezed at. They were just very clear on the targets of energy demand limits they set. This is new build, and this is aimed at commercial buildings. They set incentives in the form of tax breaks and planning gain to developers who signalled the desire to go early, and then they've given the warning that in 2025, you know, the sword of Damocles will come down, and people will be expected to be net zero. So, okay, watch that space. But, you know, there's absolute clarity on the route map, and that's what we need here, really. So that's it, really. But just to remind us about the collaborative approach, I'm a member of the EDGE group, which has partly helped Martin Hearn and others organise some of the sessions at futurebuild. Our report, which is now, I think, 3-4 years old, which Paul Morell chaired, Collaboration for Change, reminds us that we cannot do this in isolation. It has to be a cross-industry initiative. We have to take this level of responsibility. And kind of wouldn't you know, but Climate Change Committee handily last week before futurebuild have reminded us that our housing stock is currently not fit for purpose in terms of the net zero agenda, and our existing stock is languishing in the doldrums. So we have a challenge, and we have to grasp the opportunity. So looking forward to hearing from the other speakers as to how to do this. And yeah, I urge you to see the good work the Good Homes Alliance is doing, because we're sponsoring some of these events.